Hello, I'm Raywin.
Okay.
And we designed and ran a Comp 50 wearables course, which is for software students to learn hardware through wearable devices.
So 50 was kind of a brainchild born of the work that Chris and I were able to do on his typewriter kind of over the last year or so. And we designed the course to sort of be reminiscent of what I was able to get from that experience. So what we really wanted was to get students with software-driven backgrounds to gain some experience and be introduced to hardware and the basics of circuitry. So the idea was that emphasizing hands-on learning and some multimedial applications of these principles, students would hopefully be able to kind of express their creativity and mastery of the materials in such a way that they could conceive of and design a small, preferably wearable device. And we have a bit of a different structured project than a lot of you guys, so we've deviated a bit from the norm and aren't exactly following the outline that Chris gave. So we're going to give you a quick sense of what the course looked like based on our syllabus, and then kind of a little background on what went into preparing and organizing the course, and then wrap it up with some reflections that we have on what worked, what didn't, what was particularly tricky, and then also what we're able to take away from the experience. So the first step of our course was introducing people to what hardware is, kind of providing them with this foundation of what is a circuit, what is a resistor, why do we have pull-up and pull-down resistors, and what we wanted was to have the skills that they would need in order to succeed later in the course when we asked them to go off on their own, and kind of build those up in the first 2 to 3 weeks. And then we had a project that would hopefully be a culmination of the skills that we hoped that they would have gained at that point, and would really nicely illustrate kind of their mastery of them, as well as, you know, allow for some creativity. And you can see some of the projects that they came up with pictured here.
So for the next month, we tried to get them more into independent learning for their project 2, which was going to be creating a minified project of the ultrasonic sensors. You may have noticed on the last slide that a couple of their projects were a little bit bigger, so we were trying to prepare them for getting into the smaller mindset, getting them to solder surface mount pieces, etc., for making sure that they could create a wearable device rather than a box or something. We started with them examining data sheets so that they could present their findings, and we kind of just went, look at these data sheets, so that when they presented, we could see what they got from them. And then we went back and sort of showed them things that they could get from the data sheets, like the current, the maximum current where the part would not just explode, so that we could get them more into looking for things that they wouldn't have to just come to us for questions every single time. This sort of allowed them to branch off and have more versatile products for their ultrasonic sensors, and their final presentations had them using new components where they put it all together with what we had just shown them in this last month. Their final project now is what they're working on currently. We wanted them to do more modular design, have their software, their hardware, their user experience all working separately, basically, so that in these last 2 weeks they're bringing it all together for their final presentations on May 5th, which you should all come out to. But hopefully that is this is their main point of the project, of this whole class. So this was the last half of the class. We started right before spring break, and we are finishing now.
So the syllabus gives a pretty nice snapshot of how we actualized the mission of this course. But there's a lot more that actually went into structuring and organizing kind of how this was actually being captured in the course calendar. So outside of even the calendar, it's looking at materials. What are important materials that we are going to need for the students to have to tinker with? But also critical ones that they're going to need in order to complete these projects, and they are going to need to know how to use them. Where do we fit that in? Developing assignments, figuring out kind of what we want from an assignment, the big idea behind it, and then actualizing it, making sure that we're all on the same page about it. And then also defining expectations, both in a broad sense of what we expect from students day to day in the class and kind of going off doing work on their own, but also in any given assignment, like what are the deliverables, like how are we going to measure what they're giving us, and what should they be kind of comparing what they're working on against. So as a student, when I get an assignment, it's kind of my single point of truth, and then everything I do just gets based off of that, and then you clarify things on Piazza. But the writing of assignments is actually a lot more multifaceted and a lot trickier even than that. We kind of went in thinking of a bunch of skills that we wanted them to be able to master through the assignment, and then refined that further to find, like, okay, what's a common theme, or what's a big idea that can really capture all of these things that we want to see from them. But then that's the straightforward part, because the actual, like, or at least what we found to be complicated was actually writing it down in such a way that it's using language words that the students are going to understand, but also not using language that's restricting them in any way or confusing them. So we want to define what we want from them, but we also don't want to be too strict in doing that, so that we can still allow for creativity. We want to provide some level of detail that kind of communicates the spirit and the purpose, but not so much that it kind of overwhelms them with information or stifles their ability to go off and do kind of cool things on their own.
So for grading, we figured that it was going to be best if we had one single point of truth for how all these projects were graded. So I was in charge of grading to make sure everything was standardized, and as Kate said, everything needed to be predetermined and well-defined going into that grading, so that when we came across projects that were slightly different, we had a good basis of what we were expecting to see from the students. We needed to make sure that we already had we already knew what we were going to have for uniform deductions for late assignments, and making sure that students had proven an effective use of their skills. So into that was sort of the expectation side of that. We needed to tell them exactly what we expected from them. That was something that we realized early on was going to be a little bit tricky because of interpretation of assignments. You always want to leave something open-ended so that the students have creativity, but you don't want to leave it too open-ended that you have very above and beyond projects alongside minimal requirements met, and how to balance the grading of those two projects. So we wanted to have feedback that reflected the amount of work put into the project, but we didn't want to penalize those too much who had put in effort, but it was the base requirements. So it's a fine line that we need to make more clear in our instructions for the project. So in retrospective, this was something, what worked well were the projects, right? Them going off and learning on their own. Hands-on in-class learning. They loved being able to build things. They loved seeing their projects come to life. It was something that even when we were doing a demo, we had them follow along to play with the circuits and everything. The other thing that really worked well that we kind of learned as we were going along was handouts to follow along. We were introducing tons of new terms to them all at once. We didn't exactly have time in lectures necessarily to explain every single term we were going to be using. And what we found was really helpful was to have handouts that Kate created that they could hear a term and be like, wait, what? Go to their handout. Oh, that's what they're talking about. And that way we had a range of students who were either from ES3 and ES4 or who had never seen circuits before. So we didn't want to spend too much time covering the very basics just so that we could keep things interesting, but we also wanted a way for everybody to be able to find what we were talking about easily.
Yeah, so, which leads us into places to improve. One of the biggest pieces of feedback that students had for us was the organization of classes was not always it didn't flow quite right. And that early on, at least, was in huge part a product of having the three of us kind of working on these things together but separate. So we'd come together, we'd say, this is the big idea that we're capturing, these are the high points that we want to cover, and then we'd say, okay, like Raymond's gonna cover this, Kate's gonna cover this, Chris is gonna cover this, like break. And then we'd get into class and we wouldn't quite have exact enough of a breakdown of Chris is gonna go, then Raymond's gonna go, then Kate's gonna summarize what the assignment is going to be. And the result of that was that we looked a little bit frazzled. And also students found it a little bit difficult to follow because we all have pretty different styles of presenting information. So when Chris would start to maybe go into things that Raymond was planning on covering, and then Raymond starts talking about them again, but in the middle of what she's talking about, it's not really a linear progression, and it's difficult for them to follow. And then if, for instance, I'm making the handouts in the morning, if I don't have all the information that's going to be presented across the board, I can't include all of it. I can just put my best guess as to what's going to be referenced in there, so that if there's a term that they end up using a lot of that's not on the sheet, then students, it becomes less of a resource for the students. So better and earlier lecture planning was definitely something to improve upon, but also now we have a kind of foundation for anyone that picks up the course from here. We also, quizzes are at present a huge part of their grade, and they had one quiz, which averaged out to be about a B, which is actually, strictly speaking, pretty good. That's pretty average. Yeah. But, so we maybe should have done a better job of figuring out when to do quizzes. We didn't want to stress people out. This was supposed to be more of a course in exploring these concepts than like feeling like there's a lot of pressure on them to really have the exact science of it down. But we needed to do a better job of measuring that at more regular intervals and giving them more immediate feedback. And then additional challenges, even outside of kind of the way the course was implemented, was orchestrating details between the three of us was really tricky, but also there's a power dynamic at work here, which to not address that I think would be not being completely transparent about what the challenge was for us. In that, Chris is, you've taught for a little while, I guess. You're pretty good at it. But Chris has so much more experience than us, and he is an authority figure that we have to kind of defer judgment to. But we also are kind of splitting this course evenly amongst each other. So making sure that we were able to have our voices heard in such a way that's not kind of mitigating his authority was definitely a challenge for the two of us, and something that's a skill that we're definitely going to need to bring into the workplace. And the other kind of flip side of power dynamics was we were dealing with peers in class, and we had to enforce rules against peers who, some of them thought that we were just TAs and so dismissed anything we said for a while until we kind of fixed that. But to kind of have everyone saying oh, Chris is clearly the only single point of truth. If Kate or Raylan says something, it's not as legit as if Chris says it. Was something that, we just had to address in part to the class, but also recognize and work within those restrictions. So this was a huge learning experience for us in several different ways. We've more or less touched on a lot of the takeaways that we've had for this. Do you have anything?
Mostly just learning communication between three professors was the biggest challenge that we faced, and really had to figure out what we were doing. And I think we eventually did get it worked out near the end, or halfway through. And we've been still working on it, so.
Yeah, and exams and quizzes are really hard to write, so don't blame your professors when they procrastinate it, because it's super hard, and the hardest thing that I maybe did for this course was figuring out how to write a block of code for an exam. Because you're do I optimize this the way I want to optimize code? Do I optimize this for readability? Do I optimize it for extensibility? Do I optimize it, how do I balance all these things? Because the way the person's going to...
110 students.
There's a lot of things to consider, and this leads very nicely into this. We are so thankful for all the help that people offered us. We have a wealth of resources here, of fantastic professors that we could talk to when we were stuck. But then especially a few folks, Sam Geyer, who has explored a lot of this on his own, Warren, who came out of his office, talked to us, and even ordered new equipment for us, and then obviously Chris Gregg, who is not only in charge of running this class, in charge of running a lecture that has over 300 students in it. Something on the order of 300 students. But also spent a lot of time sitting down with us and designing a new course from scratch. So thank you so much for that. And does anyone have any questions?
Yeah.
Have you guys ever run an ex-college course by any chance?
So I actually started to last semester, but then I wasn't here. So I helped plan a whole ex-college course over the summer, and then wasn't able to teach it.
How would you compare the
So just in planning wise, I feel like Kate did a lot of this course planning wise because I wasn't here. Over the summer, planning wise, and I've taught courses for high school students before. And the ex-college course was completely different in terms of we had to know exactly what we were reading. We had to go through and get all of the books, all of the articles, everything in terms of, it was very literature based. It was going to be a sci-fi course. So it was very different in terms of this is very hands-on. That was going to be more of a discussion-based course. This one we had to come up with assignments that had clear definitions. That one we were going to be like, read this thing and we'll talk about it. So it was very different in that sense. But from high schooler point of view, the courses I've taught for high schoolers had to be even more well-defined than this. And I feel like this one was a little bit more tricky in terms of balancing that we give them free reign for some things. And it's a college class. We need to have some college expectations of they need to be able to extrapolate from what we give them versus high schoolers, which is very spoon-fed. I give them everything that they need to know for this one project. So sort of that difference, I guess, with this course.
First of all, fantastic project and fantastic presentation. And less a question about like the course itself and more a question about your experience in it. As somebody who's leaving an undergraduate education and has now had the opportunity to teach undergraduates, what do you think in the future as students we can do, like in learning situations independent of the college setting, to optimize the experience for both the learner and the student?
Oh, for the love of God, speak in class.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God. This is something that in Comp 11 labs I struggle with because I have a particularly quiet lab this semester. So I can't like take the temperature of the room very easily or get feedback on where people stand with anything I've just said. But in this class in particular, where you're not quite sure what a reasonable kind of timeline or set of expectations to have for them as far as like kind of metabolizing and actually learning these concepts, it becomes even more important for us to be able to like get a read on where people stand with it and what we need to maybe spend more time on or what we're even spending too much time on, or what ways do we kind of demonstrate these concepts, what different ways from what we've already done to kind of help further drive it home. And the way that we do that is by knowing people's feedback, by knowing where people stand, and by having them talk. And I hate talking in classes, but like I'll try now.
I also have really quickly 2 more things to add to that. One, I found out from grading, please tell your professors, like, if you're not going to be able to make it like a day before rather than the day of, being like, oh, by the way, nobody can make it that day when you told us a week ago. It's actually super frustrating, I've realized. I'm like, because I've done that before too, where I'm like, oh, right, I forgot to tell you, we can't make it. And I'm like, I feel so bad as a student, but like as the professor, I'm realizing how frustrating that really is. And then 2, don't offer to buy your professor a drink to try and get a better grade.
Don't do that.
Don't.
Like, just don't do
That
it,
happened.
please. No.
It's just not cool.
Sort of a response to that like whole question, or like the whole speaking in class thing. I found like the professors who ask questions directly to specific students are able to sort of control the dialogue a little more, and it gets like a little better sense of like what the students know. When you guys are asking questions, is it just like general ask the class, or would you sort of do that targeted question asking?
I think it was very. Sometimes it was like just across the board at the class. Sometimes it was specifically at people. But I think from what I was really seeing when people weren't necessarily giving us feedback is that they didn't always have the language to use to describe where they were getting lost, or even like they just didn't have a way to describe what they were hung up on, or they were hung up on the full concept and didn't know how to say, like, the last 15 minutes were a total blur, and like, can you just repeat all of that? Because either of those pieces of feedback would be totally fine and legitimate, and you'd just be like, okay, the way I explain this concept, you know, I'll rethink it. We need to do it in a new way.
We've also tried to talk to individual groups and individuals about where they are in the process, especially since getting the feedback, the midterm feedback, we realized that we weren't doing enough, like, give and take. And so we've tried to meet with individual groups more closely, just to like make sure that we are reading that correctly.
Yeah, they're currently all broken up into separate project groups and working kind of within those groups on something that they've outlined themselves.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Anyone else? Anyone else? Because I will probably take the next 10 minutes.
Can I go first, man?
I think we got one more before you go to the next.
Okay,
May I?
go ahead, go.
So you kind of glossed over it, but that was a pretty deep insight you gave about a student
Yeah.
trying to buy you a drink. Can you,
Oh.
like, what'd you do?
What happened?
So, like, unfortunately, because we are working with our peers, it was, like, I went to a formal, and one of our students was also at that formal, and they were joking about, like, getting around, like, an issue, and, like, I guess this is a very specific case. So, there's this one team couldn't meet that day before, and I told them that they would have to get some points a point deducted for like not letting us know on time and it being basically late in that case. And so he just came up to me at the dance, and we were just like talking about the project, and he was like, "Can I just buy you a drink and you'll just forget that we like forgot to do that?" And I was like, no. And so like nothing came of it. Didn't get a drink from him or anything. Went off on our own separate ways. But it was still like one of those situations where you're like, maybe like try it and separate like class and social places is what I realized.
And that's one of those places where we kind of talked about this a lot, but where expectations, having really clear and defined expectations of like, it can say it on the sheet. If this is late, we can deduct points.
Yeah.
We might even say we will deduct points. And then just having it down there makes it so that it's less of a negotiable thing and makes it easier like on a peer-to-peer level. Like I already said it, like sorry about it.
Yeah.
No one else is trying to ask for this special treatment versus if you leave something undefined, then like people feel like they can kind of appeal to your better judgment.
And then they talked about this a little bit. The power dynamic was Chris is sometimes a pushover and ends up saying, "Oh yeah, you can hand it in a day late," and that undermined their authority. So we work on those details.
Created by a script, out of my hands.
Name. We got time for like one good question.
I'll take 2. So first of all, I want to say that this was I really did want to come in to see this presentation. You did fantastic work. This was a very good presentation, and thank you, by the way, for teaching to you and Chris, working with Chris on this course. Can you help us understand what's the case for this course? How did this all begin? I guess, like, why was this course created? I mean, what's the case? What's the case for it? Can you help us understand, like, the reasoning behind why this course was created?
Yeah, so I went into an advisor meeting with Chris. He was like, should I drop this class? I don't know if I should drop this class. Chris, do I drop this class? And I think it might have been the second or third time. It was the first time I officially came in his office to like go over this conundrum, but I think he was sick and tired of hearing it. And he had the typewriter on his desk. He was like, Kate, for the love of God, if you drop that class, I will tell you what my secret project is. I will even let you help me with it. So I was like, done, I'll drop it. What is it? Tell me. And it was his typewriter thing. So he would kind of, it started to build, and then we did a lot more over the summer, but I would get to meet up with him while he was working on this typewriter, and he would just be like, all right, like, this is a shift register. And I'm like, what's a shift register? He's like, look at this data sheet. And so I spend a really long time looking at a highly technical document, being like, I don't know what this is, but I want to know. Like, and then, like part of the way through the summer, we were kind of finding, I have very little patience. I sat through like a class of ES3, and then dropped because it was terrifying. and I didn't understand a word of what was said the first day. And Chris is sitting there being like, you know, like, it's cool that you have this experience. It's very hands-on kind of exposure to hardware, and you're finding out how it works, not because you know Ohm's Law really well. I didn't even know Ohm's Law until kind of putting together the course materials for this, for being perfectly honest. Sorry, Chris. But, you know, finding that this kind of tinkering, this hands-on side of things could really be a great tool to use for getting people excited about this stuff, and kind of learning through example as opposed to being lectured at.
That actually leads up to my other big question, and I would appreciate if you would be really blunt and honest about this. Can you tell me about the gaps of the students before they entered the class and after? Like, what gaps did you notice in the students? Like,
Oh, man. One thing that we really noticed was a lot of them hadn't taken Comp 20 or higher level comp courses, which we realized was going to be pretty important in the self-learning.
But we didn't realize that for a couple weeks.
Right, we didn't realize it until we were getting feedback from the, like, midterm feedback, and it was something that, like, we were really surprised when they'd come to us and they'd be like, hey, what's this thing? And we're like, well, did you Google it? And they're like, what? And so it was one of those things where we realized that they had only had very hand-holdy experiences up until this point. And they didn't know how to go off and answer some of, or even like try and find the answers before coming to us.
Well, and sometimes they would look for the answers, but they would, get to the Wikipedia page or whatever they were looking at, and they just wouldn't understand the language that the page was using. They just didn't have enough depth in CS quite yet, or experience, to figure out what some of those more basic terms was. And that's not even gonna get solved if you keep clicking on links to the words that you don't get, because they're not explaining enough and basic enough principles for them to be able to fully get it. So someone was like, I don't get what a client server model is, and it is killing me because I keep looking at all these resources and all of them are explaining it in terms that I don't even know. Or we were talking in class about something required a UInt 8.
Right.
And I saw a bunch of people's eyes glaze over, and I realized it was because they hadn't taken Comp 40 and they hadn't had to deal with a UInt 62 or whatever, or 64, jeez. But they didn't understand that there were different kinds of integers, and so that was even something that we needed to touch on. Versus people that have taken a bunch of not only CS classes, but ES3 and ES4, and already knew a bunch of the hardware and tinkered with it on their own. That was a really wide spread to have covered.
It was something we were expecting that they wouldn't have hardware, but we expected that they would have enough software. So it was something that we had to kind of go on the fly for trying to make sure that everybody was on the same page.
so I do want to close. I don't think you understand how valuable, I don't think you understood what you've accomplished with this course, what you and Chris. First of all, the importance of a topic like wearables. If you take a look at the future of things, I don't have a crystal ball, but if you take a look, you might have to read a lot of literature about the Internet of Things. It's not only now we're seeing a mesh of hardware and software. I've said this many times, and I even said this at MITE on Friday. It's if you're doing computer science and you don't know anything about the hardware and embedded system side, it's very hard now to do anything.
Right.
If you're on the other side of things, if you're doing hardware and you don't know anything about software, it's impossible to do things. So that's one. But number two, the other thing that's so important about what you've done is, at the School of Engineering, I don't know if you know the direction where things are going. It's more design and more interdisciplinary courses, and you've done that. And number three, and I've had so much bone to pick with this issue over the last year and a half, is you might have seen me post a few things on 199 that something along the line that college is a joke. And it's that most schools take way too long to go over students' heads. And you've done that with this course, and certainly with 40 as well too. So I certainly really want to thank you and Chris for putting this on this semester. You've done a lot. I mean, I don't think you understand what you've accomplished.
Thanks, Ming. Appreciate it.